What you're seeing behind me is one of multiple locations that have been burning in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the course of the night. A second night since Jacob Blake was seen shot in the back 7 times by a police officer. And what you are seeing now, these images came and come in stark contrast to what we saw over the course of the daytime hours in Kenosha and into the early evening, which were largely peaceful demonstrations in the face of law enforcement.
Joining me now, my buddy Julio Rosas, senior writer for Town Hall, also author of the book Fiery but Mostly Peaceful. It's an outstanding book, by the way. Julio, you were actually on the ground after St. George Floyd died and all those different protests. Did you get a real peaceful vibe? You're a Marine. You know exactly what peaceful and not peaceful looks like.
No, not at all. And really, when I went to the first one in Minneapolis right after everything started, I actually thought that I would cover Minneapolis and then go back home, and then that would be that. But as the months continued and riots would just continue to happen, and at the very first one in Minneapolis, I mean, you had Ali Velshi with burning building behind him. He was saying that it wasn't an unruly protest, but that there were fires that had been started, and so that to me signaled that this is how the media was really going to try to cover these things. And so it was going to be up to myself and a handful of others, but independent and other conservative news outlets, to try their best to cover these riots when they come up as often as we could, because we knew that the mainstream media was going to try their best to justify, excuse, or just downplay what was happening, when obviously what was happening was inexcusable in terms of the response to some of these actions. And really, like with what you play with Kenosha, that one, it really, really hurts to see, because an entire town was destroyed over a justified police action.
Who were these people, Julio? We're talking about doing a real focus on the street animals, the Antifa types, the Black Lives Matter types. It's so far beyond me to show up at some city where I'm not from and start bashing in windows and hurting people. Yet there are apparently a lot of people who do that in this country. Who are these people?
Well, they view themselves as revolutionaries. I mean, they truly believe that what they're doing is taking action against this inherently oppressive state against minorities, and particularly Black people. And so you have a lot of those on the far left, but then you also have kind of like this anarcho-communism types within the Antifa groups, and they are across the country, but they are concentrated in places like the Pacific Northwest, in places like Los Angeles, because obviously that's where the kind of the ideological breeding grounds are the strongest. And so really it's interesting, because I mean, with the recent riots in Atlanta over the police training facility that they're calling Cop City, of those that were arrested, a majority of those were actually from outside Atlanta. And so it is not unheard of, and it's actually kind of the norm, really, for at least the really hardcore believers in this far left ideology to actually show up and do kinetic action. And then, of course, you do have locals who show up. Kenosha, again, as an example, it really got hit hard, because not only did you have the locals, but you had people coming in from Chicago and Milwaukee, because it's kind of sandwiched in between those two metropolitan areas. So it's a hodgepodge of people. It's a coalition of these really radical individuals.
Those cities that suffered all that damage, are they all back on their feet? You don't see anything about them now. You're not looking at burned out buildings. Are they all fine now?
No. And you don't even have to use the recent examples in 2020. I mean, you go far back as the 60s. Look what happened to Newark and Detroit. I mean, those cities have been just in shambles since the 60s. And I always find it amusing a little bit when the left says, oh, well, 93% of the BLM protests were peaceful, and it was only 7%. And to that I say, thank God. Because could you imagine if it was 10% or 20% violent? Just in that 7%, there was over $2 billion worth of damage. And that's just in the money sense. There was multiple people who were killed. There were hundreds wounded on both, within like regular civilians and within the police. And so it only takes one riot to set back a community decades of economic prosperity. And like I said, you go back to some of these other places like Newark and Detroit. And today, I mean, Minneapolis is nowhere near the city and the metropolitan area that it once was. I was there last summer to do a ride along with the police department there. And what really stuck out to me was it was the middle of the day. It was before I was going to go out with them. It was the middle of the day. It was a work day, and there was nobody on the streets. And it was a nice day too. And there was nobody on the street. It was a ghost town. The only people that you would pass by were the strung out homeless people that had taken over the bus stops. And so that's the reality that a lot of these cities are today. And again, you get called a racist, you get called a fearmonger if you point out those facts.
Support the First TV today and get instant access to exclusive specials like Who is Ron DeSantis, the history of FBI scandals, and America's worst presidents. Visit thefirsttv.com/support or download the First TV app to become a supporter and start watching today.